Hello, this is historian Stephen Ujifusa, and today I'm going to talk a bit about my book Barons of the Sea, which was written in 2018, published by Simon & Schuster. And this was a book about the great American clipper ships that sailed the seas between New York and Boston and China, and also these ships helped develop the state of California during the gold rush of the 1840s and the 1850s. This book was not just a story about these magnificent sailing ships of the 1840s and the 1850s, but also about the families that helped create them. And this book came at a very meaningful time for me because when this book was published in 2018, I had recently become a father, and this book is as much an exploration about the theme of family as it is about these great sailing ships. I had to learn a whole new language writing about sailing ships. I am myself, I'm not really a sailor. I have been on a sailing trip to the Bahamas several years ago. I learned how to sail sunfish at summer camp in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, but I have never really, when writing this book, I had not really sailed. So I had to learn a whole language about square rigging or square rig sailing ships. I'm grateful to my mentor, Louis Howland, and many others who basically guided me along about writing about great sailing ships, about the art of sail, which in the mid-19th century was ubiquitous in the northeastern United States. Shipyards were common. Most young men who grew up on the shores of Connecticut or Massachusetts or Maine learned how to sail, learned about shipbuilding. The city of New York in the early to mid-19th century was a port. It was not just a financial center. The whole East River was lined with shipyards. And that was one of the biggest industries in New York City. Today, New York City has forgotten about much of its maritime heritage. It's basically enshrined in a museum, the South Street Seaport Museum. But also, these ships were owned by a series of interlocking families. And this is a time before there were publicly traded corporations. Business and family were the same. And the family at the center of Barons of the Sea is a famous family, a family by the name of Delano. And the main character, Warren Delano II, who was born in Fairhaven, Massachusetts in 1809, he became the maternal grandfather of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So in many ways, while writing this book, I also wanted to learn what sort of dynamics helped create a presidential family, what sort of family made Franklin Roosevelt, but also his mother, Sara Delano Roosevelt, who was Warren II's daughter. And Sara Delano Roosevelt herself would later say that Franklin Roosevelt was much more a Delano than a Roosevelt. And this exploration took me to reading deep into the papers of these New England families, which ultimately would form the backbone of what we would call the Northeastern establishment of New York and Boston and of the Ivy League, and of which Franklin Delano Roosevelt was very much a part. Now, Warren Delano II was the son of a whaling captain. He did not come from tremendous wealth. He was a part of a small group of men who traveled from New England to New York to find their opportunity in the early 19th century. From there, he sailed to China to do business in the opium and tea trade, which was a very mysterious, very shadowy business, which was one of the few ways that allowed a small group of young men to make a fortune very, very fast. And what happened in Canton stayed in Canton. They would come back having made their fortunes and would marry and then go into other forms of business. Among these forms of businesses was investing in clipper ships. Now, the Delano family had an estate on the Hudson River called Algonac, located in Newburgh, New York, on the west bank of the Hudson River. And for generations of Delanos, this became home. And China and Warren Delano's life in China was something that was omnipresent at Algonac. The house was filled with Chinese art and artifacts. A dinner gong was used to summon people to dinner. I think that's where actually that concept came in. We see it in the Edwardian era, but I think it started with these Chinese merchants, with these American men who spent time in China. And among this small group of New Englanders, they had become proteges of a Chinese merchant named Hao Qua, Wu Ping Chen, as was his Chinese name. who basically did business with the American firm of Russell and Company, and his Hauqua's tea was traded for the opium that unfortunately and sadly was smuggled in from Turkey and China by men like Warren Delano II, who controlled a firm called Russell and Company. And Algonac was meant to be a refuge from this life that these men had led. And the contrast between their Canton bachelor days of the 1820s and 1830s, and with the life they created in the Hudson River, and also in places like the North Shore of Boston and in Newport, Rhode Island, could not be more striking. Their goal was basically to create a family fortune and, in many ways, maintain these ties that they had as men together on the other side of the world. But the way they made their fortune was not meant to be discussed. So this is chapter 15, entitled Hill and River, from Barons of the Sea, which takes us to the world of Algonac in the 1840s and the 1850s, the house of which Warren Delano II was patriarch and master of his large family. This was also the house in the early 1900s, I believe it was 1905, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt marries his fifth cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt. So, chapter 15, Hill and River from Barons of the Sea. The shores are cultivated by the water's edge and lean up in graceful rather than bold elevations. The eminences around are crested with the villas of the wealthy inhabitants of the metropolis. Summer houses, belvederes, and water steps give an air of refreshments to the banks. Nathaniel Parker Willis, American Scenery, 1840. The 1850s was a golden age of gardening in America, and the Delano family estate at Algonac was one of the horticultural crown jewels of the northeastern United States. Influenced by the grounds of aristocratic English estates designed in the 1700s by Lancelot Capability Brown, Algonac's landscape blurred the line between natural and man-made. There were apple orchards, spruce groves, formal flower beds, and a kitchen garden that supplied produce for the table. Like many large houses of its era, Algonac had greenhouses for cultivating fresh flowers, such as exotic and fashionable orchids, year-round. Warren Delano's son Frederick wrote admiringly of landscaper Andrew Jackson Downing's skill with Algonac's plantings. Emphasis was naturally placed on adaptability to every season, he wrote of his childhood home. Thus, evergreens, Norway spruces, hemlocks and pines, sugar maples, elms, ashes, beeches, locusts, nut trees, and oaks for other seasons, not to mention other less familiar shrubs and the like. In the middle of one night, Warren Delano awakened his entire family, including little Sara, to see something special in the garden. Warren wrapped Sara in his strong arms and led his brood outside into the moonlit grounds, the Hudson River glimmering in the distance. There in front of them was a night-blooming cereus, a species of cactus whose luminous white and gold flowers appear only once a year. Native to China, cereuses were expensive and difficult to grow outside of the tropics. Those who could afford to cultivate them often hosted parties to celebrate their blooming. Sara and her siblings never forgot the flower's magical bloom, as well as its rich fragrance. By dawn, the cereus flower had withered away, but the enchantment of Algonac to the Delano children grew with each passing year. As one of them wrote, as the years rolled on, the family increased in numbers. The trees grew, and it became more and more truly a home. There were family accidents, of course. One day little Sara tripped and hit her head against a cabinet in the drawing room. Rather than call a doctor, Warren grabbed a needle and thread and sewed up the wound himself. Delano also sponsored the construction of a Unitarian church in nearby Newburgh. As a devout minimalist Calvinist, Delano could not bear to expose his family to a whiff of the high church Anglicanism that was sweeping New York society. However luxurious their estates, the Puritan values of New England remained strong among the clipper ship magnates. There is no standing room for any creed between our Unitarian faith and the papal church, Delano declared. Commerce was visible all the time from Algonac's windows, but it never came calling on the Delano family in their quiet home on the west bank of the Hudson River. Occasionally, a paddle wheel steamer belonging to Cornelius Vanderbilt, its decks cluttered with sightseers, would chuff past on its way to Albany. Tall sloops carrying cargo bound for New York from the Erie Canal glided silently in the other direction, their trapezoid sails billowing in the wind. Delano could hear the roar of locomotives on the opposite bank. Here at Algonac, named for the Algonquin word for hill and river, the patriarch hoped his Yankee Delano clan would reside for generations to come. It was a serene, semi-feudal existence on America's Rhine. Warren was now one of America's few dozen millionaires. He had earned the $100,000 competence he had sought as a youth, enough to make one a member of the American upper strata, and on his second trip to China in his middle years, he made far more, with his bride and young daughters at his side. His fortune was diversified in a variety of sectors, a strategy that seemed to insulate his family from the economic panics that shook the American economy every 10 years or so. By the 1850s, according to family sources, Warren Delano and his brothers had ownership stakes in at least 8 other clippers. Although the records have been lost, I can surmise that these included all swift ships flying his good friend Abbott Lowe's house flag: Hauqua, Samuel Russell, Oriental, Surprise, M.B. Palmer, Contest, Jacob Bell, and the recently salvaged Great Republic. He had additional holdings in Maryland copper mines, Pennsylvania coal mines, and Manhattan real estate. The Delano fortune seemed self-sustaining, generating enough income through dividends to allow Warren, Catherine, and their growing brood of children to live in halcyon splendor, secluded from the rest of the world. In an age when the average life expectancy was between just 38 and 44 years, Warren had waited until his 30s to get married, all because he had sacrificed so many of his prime years in China making money. This delay no doubt magnified Warren's fervent obsession with family. He did not let the cares of business intrude into the pages of the Algonac diaries, nor did he talk about his business accomplishments. According to one family member, there was an inhibition handed down from father to son, and common in New England as in Old England. Don't brag. It's a man's job to do things, but men of action should not talk of their exploits. Another side to the Delano ethos was one should never burden people with your problems. Life was uncertain enough as it was, even in the grandeur of Algonac. Whining was never acceptable, especially in public. The Delanos occasionally paid visits to other stately homes, including the Staten Island, New York summer retreat of William Henry Aspinwall, remembered in the family as a good friend of Warren's. There he would view an art collection that included works by Spanish old masters Bartolomé Esteban Murillo and Diego Velázquez, one of which, according to Delano family biographer Rita Halle Clayman, was purchased from the Dutch royal family for what was said to be a fabulous sum. Aspinwall may also have visited the Delanos at Algonac, as his sister Mary Rebecca had recently married a nearby squire, the reclusive physician Isaac Roosevelt, whose Rosedale estate was just across the Hudson. Of this alliance of old Dutch pedigree and Yankee shipping money, Isaac's grandson Franklin would write one day, "Thus the stock kept virile and abreast of the time." When in New York for the winter season, Warren and Catherine attended lectures by the transcendental philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, who preached the values of self-reliance to adoring audiences. Although a committed abolitionist, Emerson was afraid to attack slavery in public for fear of mob violence. In writing, however, he was explicit. If slavery continued, the name of this nation, hitherto the sweet omen of religion and liberty, will stink to the world. By the 1850s, the Yankee poet was firmly in the patronage of the circle of merchants from his old Canton days, and his daughter Edith had married into the family. Her husband was William Hathaway Forbes, son of John Murray Forbes. Of his daughter's father-in-law, Emerson wrote, "Never was such a force, good meaning, good sense, good action, combined with such domestic, lovely behavior, such modesty and persistent preference for others. Wherever he moved, he was the benefactor." In the 19th century, literary snobs looked down upon men in trade as uncultured. Emerson firmly removed Forbes from such a view because he believed the great China merchant had a holistic perspective regarding art, philosophy, and commerce. How little this man suspects, with his sympathy for men and his respect for lettered and scientific people, that he is not likely in any company to meet a man superior to himself. Now, in closing, after finishing reading this excerpt, I also note the play, the entry into the story of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great philosopher, and another family that was related to the Delanos, the Forbes family of Boston. And these families also sponsored and helped support members of this new emergent American movement in philosophy and in the arts, men like Ralph Waldo Emerson. And John Murray Forbes, by the way, was a very close business partner of Warren Delano II. In fact, his wife, Warren Delano II's wife, Catherine, was a cousin of John Murray Forbes. They introduced each other. And this was an ethos that was continued well into the 1940s or 1950s, I would say. I would say the Great Depression really put an end to it, of life on the Hudson, life in places like Nashon Island off the coast of Massachusetts and in Newport, Rhode Island. And my own hunch is that men like John Murray Forbes and Warren Delano II, they spent time in China in the 1820s and 1830s and saw the lavish palace of their mentor, the merchant Haokua, which was grander and more luxurious than anything they had ever seen in the United States, back when the young United States, especially New England, was a nation of pretty primitive cities, clapboard houses, and they saw something this sophisticated and this grand, and they want to replicate the life they saw that Haokua led on the banks of the Hudson and on the coast of New England. And they did, and thus Algonac for Warren Delano was his version of Haokua's palace on the Hudson River Valley. And in later years, the Delano family, which also included President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whenever they were traveling and arrived safely at their destination, the cable they would always send was Algonac, which was the Delano secret password for arrived safely, all is well. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you again next time on Wet Lunch on the High Seas. This is Stephen Ujifusa.